I'm Linda Dixon from the Lexington Veterans Association, and I welcome you to a presentation on landmines, the weapon that knows no peace treaty. We also welcome our fellow veterans from the Edith Norse Rogers Memorial Veterans Hospital in Bedford, Massachusetts, and our fellow veterans from the Brockton VA Medical Center, hosted by Jennifer Cole, medical librarian for the VA Boston healthcare system. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dan Breen. Dan Breen grew up in Atlanta, where he developed a passion for history and for the Civil War in general, in particular. He earned a BA in history from the University of Wisconsin and a law degree from the University of Georgia. After briefly practicing law, he earned a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia and a PhD from Boston College. He taught history at Framingham State College and Newbury College before joining the faculty of Brandeis University, where he is senior lecturer, legal studies. Dan is an old friend and a favorite of the Lexington veterans, and it is always a pleasure to welcome him back.
All right, thanks everybody for being here, and it's so good to see so many people from prior presentations. I'm glad that you welcomed me again. I've never been here before, Brookhaven. What a wonderful place. So thanks to all the residents for joining us as well. And let's just get started with some thoughts about landmines. Landmines actually go all the way back to at least the 13th century, when the Chinese, shortly after inventing gunpowder, would use them against invading Mongol horsemen in what turned out to be a vain attempt to slow their progress into the interior of China. But they were largely forgotten for centuries and hardly used again for hundreds of years, until one man, one person, decided to reintroduce them into the field of human conflict. And this is a rather little known story of the American Civil War, because the person responsible in the 19th century for the reintroduction of landmines into warfare was that person here, General Gabriel Rains. Now, he was born back in 1803, a North Carolinian. From a very early age, he wanted to go into the military. He did go into the military after graduating from West Point. And as a 20-something, he found himself in Florida, joining the efforts to fight the Seminoles during the Seminole War of the 1830s. Very difficult on the US military, that war. They could never quite get a hold of many of the Seminole outfits operating out of swamps and heavily forested areas. So it occurred to Rains, as a young lieutenant and eventually a captain, that may be a good thing to do against the Seminoles in what amounted to a counterinsurgency kind of war, was to attempt to injure them and intimidate them through mines. And he was the one who invented the first generation of modern landmines. He called them subterra mines, and he would put them, or troops under his direction, would put them on trails through the swamps in the hopes of having a Seminole step on them and then become, of course, severely injured. He also was the first person of the US military that we know of to really make a big deal of inventing booby traps. And we know at one point he was a part of a detachment out in the forest going on expedition against the Seminoles. And he decided to set out a fake sentry, a costume dummy as a sentry, and he booby trapped it in the hope that a Seminole would come along and try to tackle the dummy, thinking it was a live person, and then maybe get blown up. And in the middle of the night, sure enough, there was an explosion, and everybody ran out to see what they thought would be, unfortunately, a dead Seminole. And it turned out that it was actually a very large pig who stumbled upon that booby trap costume sentry. Now, we don't know how many people were actually killed by these subterra mines that Lieutenant Rains came up with, but he never forgot this idea, even though the military after the 1830s didn't adopt them as part of the usual arsenal. He still thought about these mines until Fort Sumter in 1861. At that point, Rains was a lieutenant colonel in the US Army. Being a North Carolinian, he resigned from the Army, joined the Confederacy, and he found himself in 1862, this will be significant to Jim over here, almost exactly 2 years before the Battle of the Field of Lost Shoes, famous in BMI history. This was in 1862, May of 1862. There was Lieutenant Colonel Rains, about to be a general in the Confederate Army, in charge of a brigade that was helping to hold Yorktown, Virginia, against the advancing Army of the Potomac under General McClellan. And it was quite clear to him that there was no way the Confederates were going to be able to hold on to Yorktown. They were going to have to retreat towards Richmond. And at the beginning of May 1862, he was ordered to retreat. But what he decided to do before retreating was tell his men to take a bunch of old shell casings, lace them with gunpowder, put a little primer cap made of lead on top of them, and bury them just a few inches into the ground. In other words, sub-terra mines. And the idea was that when the Union Army came into Yorktown, soldiers would step on those mines, and even though they'd lost Yorktown, they could still take some casualties with them after the evacuation. And he also booby-trapped, just as he had done in Florida, things around Yorktown that he thought Union soldiers might want to pick up. Wheelbarrows here and there, cisterns of water, those were laced with little booby traps. And a bunch of the soldiers under his command couldn't believe it. They didn't want to do it. They thought that was no way to wage war. They protested, some of them, but what could they do? This was a lieutenant colonel. He was giving the orders. So after he arranged these mines and booby traps, he led his regiments out of Yorktown. And on May 4th, 1862, McClellan's soldiers went into Yorktown and began stepping on these mines, severely injuring themselves, handling the booby traps. And as you can see here, some of them began to be very badly injured that way. General McClellan was infuriated by this. He was heard to say, "This is barbarism," as he began to hear reports of what was happening to his troops. And this is in Harper's Weekly. They called them torpedoes back then, but what they really were sub-terra landmines, just as we're accustomed to today. And this was the first generation of modern landmines. It just so happened, as Rains was getting done putting these mines in the soil and then evacuating towards Yorktown, leaving Union troops to step on them and be badly hurt by them, it just so happened that right in the neighborhood, observing all this, was this man here, and that's Francis Lieber, one of the leading academics in the United States, accompanying the Army of the Potomac that May on the way towards Richmond, because what he was supposed to do was come up with what turned out to be the very first code of conduct for a soldier, an army, to obey in wartime. He was no stranger to war. Even at the Battle of Waterloo, because he was a native Prussian, left for dead on the battlefield, recovered, came to the US, became a faculty member eventually at Columbia, and his code of conduct for war was based upon the principle that nothing but military necessity could govern the kind of weapon and tactic used by soldiers in wartime. They should avoid things that simply intimidated people or that posed undue danger to civilians. And it could well be that witnessing those mines go off in regard to unsuspecting Union troops influenced him in the kind of principles that he encoded in his rules of conduct for war, the famous Lieber Code, adopted by the US Army in 1862, the first true attempt to establish a body of rules for warfare, the basis of the Geneva Conventions of the 20th century, and also the Nuremberg Principles of 1946. And so we owe something to those mines. Lieber never forgot them, and we'll see that the story of the Geneva Convention will come back into our story a little bit later on. But it's worthy of reflection, maybe for just a while, on that particular point. The introduction of this weapon, landmines, gave rise to a body of principles about the best way to conduct war on some kind of humanitarian basis. And it was those principles that would finally give rise in the 1990s to the International Convention to ban landmines. So thing eventually came full circle. Now, Union officers, when they began experiencing these mines, called them infernal engines. They refer to this tactic as dastardly. General McClellan was so angry that after emerging from Yorktown on the way to Richmond, he actually had Confederate POWs go around the camp and try to find the mines and dig them up, something that today would be banned by the Geneva Convention. Many Confederate generals didn't like this idea either. They thought it was barbaric. General Johnston refused to use them. General Longstreet protested against them as well. But Rains defended them, and his point was, we are on the defensive in the Confederacy. We're outmanned by the Union Army, outgunned by their industrial production potential. We've got to do everything we can to try to get some kind of a military advantage. And the Confederate government agreed with him and not only sanctioned the use of landmines, but also invented in 1863 the world's first landmine bureau as an adjunct to the Confederate government, and they began producing landmines in a big way. By 1864, they were quite familiar to the Union Army. Most notoriously, they were used in Georgia, my native state, to try to delay Sherman's army on the way from Atlanta to Savannah. And Sherman was so incensed about those mines between Atlanta and Savannah that he actually had Confederate POWs advance in front of the Army of the Tennessee on any trail or any road where he thought there might be mines. We don't know how many of those POWs were killed that way, but that was Sherman's order, and it was carried out. Rains himself, after the war, finally after 1865, was largely forgotten. The new restored United States did not have landmines in its arsenal after that. A lot of people wanted to forget this part of the Civil War, and they largely did. General Rains, now retired, I don't know how he did it, actually came up with a job that paid him a nice pension eventually. He went to work for the Union Quartermaster Corps after the war in Charleston, South Carolina, and did pretty well for himself. He died in 1881, and hardly anybody remembers him today. But he is the father of landmines in combat ever since the 1860s. And his design for landmines, very simple. A little bit of explosive, a primer and a fuse cap just below the ground so that you step on it, depress the primer, cause the mine to go up. That design, sub-terra design, would still, of course, be in museums, in archives around the world, ready to be made use of by any military that felt the impetus. But they wouldn't be made use of until World War I. In the early days of World War I, you never saw landmines, really not a part of the combat, until a little bit into the war, 1915, 1916. Then the Germans began executing these strategic withdrawals from frontal areas that they occupied on the Western Front. And whenever they did that, they put landmines in no man's land to entrap advancing French and British troops as they occupied what had been German trenches. And that's when these became known again. But they didn't become a big deal until these things. So that's the first generation of British tanks. That's the famous Mark I tank, which went into production in 1915, introduced into combat in 1916, and the Germans couldn't believe it when they saw these things. They went into combat September 1916. What were the Germans to do against these tanks? They tried artillery. They had to depress artillery to try to make any kind of difference with them. That didn't always work that well. One thing they tried to do was widen trenches. So when the tanks began to approach trenches, which they could usually just roll right over, maybe the trench would be so wide now that the tank would just fall into the trench. They tried doing that, but then what the British did was they would equip those tanks with a whole bunch of rolled sticks, and the tanks would go up to the German trench. They'd pile the sticks in, and eventually other tanks coming behind them would be able to go over the trench anyway, no matter how wide it was. Hardly anything seemed to work against them until the Germans decided we got to use mines. And that's how the first generation of anti-tank mines began to be emplaced by Germans desperate to do something against these things. They couldn't really make many of their own tanks in time to make a difference. I think only about a couple dozen German tanks were ever in combat before our armistice in 1918, but they could put in mines. And the thing about the anti-tank mines that were pretty effective against these things, if they went right over them, was the Germans wanted to make sure that British crews wouldn't come up and try to dig up the anti-tank mines, which could only be activated by something really heavy. So what the Germans did was they put anti-personnel sub-terra mines anywhere where there were anti-tank mines, so they'd be difficult to pick up by an individual. And so Gabriel Rains' invention, now in a big way, came back into warfare. Those tanks, many of them, were badly hurt by anti-tank mines, but ultimately they made a big difference in the war, especially in the last offensives of 1918. After which, after the armistice, once more, the British, the Americans, and the French paid very little attention to mines. And maybe this was a kind of warfare that had run its course after the end of the terrible First World War. At least people hoped that, but one country still, by the 1930s, was investing in mines. And that, of course, was Germany. What brought the mine back, the Subterra mine of Gabriel Rains, was one, in mines like that, was one particular event in the fall of 1939. So I heard somebody speaking French over here, so maybe we have an expert, if not on this particular event, at least in this aspect of World War II from the French perspective. It's September of 1939. The main part of the German army, of course, was occupied in Poland. And it occurred to the French that maybe it would be a good idea to help their gallant Polish allies by some kind of incursion across the border into Germany. Specifically, as you see here, in the Saar region, right there on the border, just to the west of the Rhine River. And so, in what amounted to a token effort, although nobody knew it at the time, French regiments and brigades crossed the border into the Saar Valley, into Germany, on September 7th, 1939. And here they outnumbered the Germans by better than 2-1. And in fact, they encountered no meaningful resistance at all. They went anywhere they wanted to. It was all very strange. They crossed the border, hardly any opposition. German power stations in Germany were still supplying French towns on the other side of the border in September of 39. And the French, wherever they went, they would find signs in French in German towns saying, if you don't fire on us, we won't fire on you. They went wherever they wanted to. They got to areas of the Siegfried Line, pillboxes that were vacant, nobody there. They went right between them. But there was one thing that held back the advance, one thing that terrified French soldiers so that there was never any meaningful chance that this advance was really going to go anywhere. Soldiers creeping forward into the Saar, French soldiers, sometimes stepped on a new kind of anti-personnel landmine that they had never seen before. The Germans called it the shrapnel mine, or the S-mine. And if you stepped on this thing, a canister would fly up from the ground to a height of a little less than 4 feet. And within less than 4 seconds, it would start spitting out shrapnel in all directions. And there was no sense running away from this thing. The shrapnel was lethal to a distance much farther than you could ever run in just a few seconds. This was terrifying to the French soldiers. They step on it, up comes this thing, starts spitting out shrapnel. It probably wouldn't kill you, but it would injure you badly. It would maim you. And it was enough to intimidate anybody who knew about it. So once the French soldiers began experiencing these things, the advance into the Saar ground to a halt. French soldiers, understandably, were so terrified of these that in some cases, a single German machine gun emplacement could delay entire French regiments who didn't want anything to do with crossing any kind of a field in front of where the Germans were. What were the French to do? Their commander, the infamous General Gamelin, had this idea, we'll show them that there's a way to deal with these things. So what Gamelin decided to do in front of French soldiers in the Saar was send groups of pigs into any area where they thought there might be these mines. But that was not calculated to restore much confidence in the minds of French infantry as they watched pigs being blown up by these things wherever they were found. And these things, of course, would soon become famous as the French advance slowed and came to a stop in the Saar. There was perhaps every reason to think if the French wanted to, they could have invaded all the way to the Rhine River in the fall of 39. But with these things, there was no chance there was going to be any morale for that. And the advance stopped, and Gamelin went back into France at the beginning of October. Now, we all know what these things were called. What did Americans call them? The famous Bouncing Betty, that's right. And this is what they looked like. When Americans got involved in the war, they gave these a very appropriate nickname, the Bouncing Betty, because it looked as if they were bouncing right up as they sprayed shrapnel in all directions. They were fearsome weapons indeed. One American soldier said, "I went through aerial bombing. I went through mortar shelling, open combat against machine guns, night patrolling, and against all of this, we had some kind of a chance, but against these mines, we had none." The only defense was not to move at all. Actually, that was really no defense at all. If you activated one of these things, up it shoots. The only thing you could really do is fall down as quickly as you could. that wouldn't mean you wouldn't get injured. It might mean there'd be less shrapnel in you, but there was really no good way to prevent an injury once you activated one of these things. And therein lies the point. When we talk about the bouncing Betty, in any mine, really, if you activate them by stepping on them, we're talking about the kind of weapon that Francis Lieber, back in the 1860s, would have detested, and that many people still do. And that's the kind of weapon that's not designed to kill you. It's designed primarily to injure you and render you inoperative for combat. Something that would stick with you for the rest of your life, depending on how bad your injury was. And of course, as we'll see, something that keeps injuring people long after wars are over, wherever they happen to be in the ground. Now, we eventually, in the United States, began producing our own versions of bouncing Bettys. They were used in Vietnam. These are Australians learning how to emplace in an arm bouncing Bettys. The Australians had a different name for them. The Australians called them jumping jacks, but they were still the same thing, bouncing Bettys. Now, untold tens of millions of mines, landmines, were laid in World War II on every fighting front. Only occasionally did they prove decisive in some way. And one place where that was true was Kursk, where the Soviets in 1943, April, were anticipating a great German tank offensive, and they laid about 4,000 anti-tank mines in front of their position wherever they thought the Germans might be going. And that did indeed disable a whole bunch of German tanks. They were immobilized long enough for Russian artillery to go to work on them. But of all the combatants in World War II, probably nobody excelled the Soviets in the amount of mines that were ultimately laid, wherever their troops went and wherever the Germans were in front of them. But still, in terms of mines per square acre, the all-time champion in World War II was not Eastern Europe, where the Soviets were. It was probably North Africa. Wherever the 8th Army fought against the Afrika Korps of Rommel, what we're talking about is minefield after minefield. At El Alamein in 1942, that battle took place in what some observers have described as one big minefield. The Germans alone, by some estimates, laid 300,000 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines in one 5-mile stretch of desert between the lines around El Alamein in the western part of Egypt. So many mines that it came to be called the Devil's Garden. And today, wherever there are mines in Egypt, and there's a lot of mines in Egypt that have never been exploded, wherever those mines are, people living there call them Devil Gardens. Don't go there, there may be mines. It didn't stop the 8th Army, could have slowed it down a bit, didn't stop it though. But nevertheless, General Rommel was a big believer in landmines. And when he came to command the Atlantic Wall in 1944, anticipating the Normandy invasion, he ordered that 50 million landmines be placed all up and down the Channel and Atlantic coast. Only a fraction of them, luckily, were in place by the time of Omaha Beach, but it was not for lack of trying. The problem is, of course, as I just mentioned, there was so many mines laid in North Africa between 1940 and 1943, untold thousands of them are still there. And Bedouin herdsmen still step on them, sometimes killed, very often badly injured. Between 1945 and the early part of the millennium, around 2000, 8,000 civilians in North Africa were badly injured by mines, almost all of them in Egypt. Consider, for example, the case of Gouma Youssef, a herdsman, northern part of Egypt. He had just finished tending to his cattle one evening. He stepped away from his tent, thought he would have some tea and enjoy the stars. And as he was walking, he heard a sudden explosion. And just like that, most of his leg was blown off. He could have bled to death. This was in the 1990s. But luckily, others heard the explosion. They got him to a hospital, and he's still there. He gets around a prosthesis the best he can. Ultimately, his prosthesis stopped working. He didn't have enough money to afford another one, so now he gets around on crutches. The problem is so bad in Egypt that by one estimate, 1/10 of all the land to the west of the Nile Valley that might be put under production and become valuable for people can't be put under production, can't be diverted to agriculture because people are terrified of going there and it hasn't been demined. And until somebody does something about that, the story will be the same. Well, that's North Africa. Now you're looking at, of course, the mine detectors here. I did want to mention that luckily for humanity, the mine detector was actually invented in 1939, just in time for World War II. And it was invented by the Poles before the German invasion. And they managed to get the design for the mine detector to Great Britain before Poland was overrun. And that's why they were in use by the 8th Army in North Africa by the time the campaigns there began, 1940 and 1941. And of course, they're still in use around the world today. What they do is they look for magnetic fields caused by metal in the soil. And if they found them, maybe there's a mine, maybe there's something to be dug up. But at least in Europe, distinct from North Africa, many of the hundreds of thousands of mines that were laid by the Germans and Soviets in Eastern Europe were dug up. They were located, they were removed, and they're not much of a problem today. Why would it be that they could be dug up so quickly and demined, deactivated, when so many mines are still in North Africa? And there's a very simple reason for that. The reason is, contrary to the Geneva Convention, but perhaps inspired by General Sherman, much of the demining, the digging up of mines, live mines, was done by German POWs. The most successful such operation actually happened in Denmark, where the Germans had laid 2 million mines all around the coastline of Denmark, fearful of a potential Allied invasion there. Beaches and accompanying farm and forest land, 2 million mines, and all of them were dug up by German POWs. They were taken out of the camps, they were given implements, and they were told to start digging. And here you see that's what they're doing right there. And that began right after the surrender in May of 1945. If they were looking for anti-tank mines, they'd have these big poles they would use to try to find them. Otherwise, they were handheld implements. They would send them into beaches, they would send them into forest land, and sometimes to save some time, what they would do is not just put them out there by hand, walking along where the mines might be. If they thought there were a lot of mines in a given area, what the Allies did, what the British did, was they put some of these German POWs at the wheel of their old Panzer tanks. And they would send the Panzer tanks into likely minefields. And they would do that because maybe the tank could get blown up, but maybe the POW would still live to do it again. And by that effort, that kind of effort, within months, every mine was gone as far as we know. In Denmark, but 149 German POWs died in the process. And that's fewer than we think about 1,000 German POWs who died in France doing much the same thing. But through those efforts, this is remarkable, at one point in the summer of 1945, when the demining was going on in Western Europe, efforts like these, largely by POWs, were responsible for clearing 10,000 mines a day, which is way more than what's possible today. 10,000 mines a day, all over Western Europe, for a total, we think, of 13 million mines. Imagine that. They dug up 13 million mines in 1945. Now you may be saying to yourself, wait a minute, that violates the Geneva Convention. You can't be using POWs for efforts like that. You'd be right to say that. Do you know how the Allies got around that? They would point to these Germans and they would say, those aren't POWs, those are recently surrendered personnel. And therefore, according to them, the Geneva Convention didn't apply. And so they had to amend the Geneva Convention, I think in 1947, and now this would be certainly, without any doubt, against international law. But at the time, they got through it with that kind of loophole. Well, that's a success story in Western Europe. But for 50 years after World War II, landmines continue to be a feature of most wars around the globe. They were easy to put together. They were also very useful in counterinsurgency efforts and also by soldiers engaged in guerrilla fighting. But as far as we were concerned, of course, the mine that's most associated with America, maybe more than any other kind of mine, is something that will be familiar to probably a lot of you. And that was, of course, that. And that's the famous Claymore mine. Does anybody know why they call it a Claymore mine? A claymore, of course, is a kind of Scottish sword, very common, especially in the 18th century. It's named the Claymore mine because the man who designed it was a Scotsman named Norman MacLeod. And so it became known as the Claymore. And the reason we have this mine is that during the Korean War, our big problem for much of the war were massed assaults, first by the North Koreans, but especially by the Chinese, beginning in 1950. And what was good against massed assaults wasn't necessarily a single mine that might injure somebody who stepped on it. What you wanted was a kind of mine that would take a lot of people at once, preferably killing them and not injuring them. And that's what a claymore mine does. So you put it up maybe on a stand right in front of an emplacement that you've got right in front of your perimeter as an infantry position, and you can activate it yourself from your position. And if it's activated in the face of the enemy, what happens is a whole array of pellets, a whole array of, not quite bullets, I don't think, but something that will pierce your flesh, will be sprayed against attacking forces over a degree, I think, of 60 degrees. And that's going to take a lot of people at once, rather than just one person stepping on the mine. I'm not somebody who's a veteran. I've never been in the service, but I would think that's pretty good advice, front towards the enemy. See, the claymore mines were famous for that inscription, front towards the enemy, which of course became a byword among people in the infantry and Marines who would use them. They were used in a big way during the Vietnam War, and they were very effective because these things would shoot about 700 pellets in one broad general direction at a speed of 4,000 feet per second. A truly formidable weapon. And if you were approaching one of these things, you can see for yourself, they're hard to see. They're olive drab in color, difficult to pick up. And so no wonder they were so effective. Thousands of them were used by the Americans in Vietnam to protect infantry positions from attack. And they were so effective that whenever they could, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, would find them, and if they could, use them against us. But it wasn't just our claymore mines that we turned the other direction and used by the enemy if they came up with one. The Chinese also eventually made their own claymore mines, as you can see here, and they would be copied and used by countries around the world after the 1960s. Claymore, or variations of the claymore, have been used around the world. They are being used right now in Ukraine, for example. And in fact, in Ukraine, at the moment, we have what is probably the most heavily mined country in the world, mostly with mines laid by the Russians, but we're selling claymore mines to the Ukrainians, and that's one of the things they're using for their part against the Russians, although most of the mines now in Ukraine are the kind that are activated by stepping on them, very similar in design and concept to what Gabriel Rains came up with all the way back in the Seminole War in the 1830s. Now, when we're talking about these anti-personnel mines, these landmines, we're talking about something unusual, because for most of human history, you didn't need to worry about a weapon once the war was over. You put the swords away, you put the muskets away. There was no reason to be concerned about them. But of course, as we saw with the Bedouins of North Africa to this day, a mine, once it's in the ground especially, maybe not so much a claymore, which you activate by personnel around the perimeter, or maybe by a tripwire. With these mines under the ground, those are the ones that are the big danger, and those are the ones that keep exploding years and years after the conflicts are at an end. That's happened in Vietnam, where all sides used anti-personnel mines. By some estimates, you probably heard this, about a third of all US casualties, especially before 1969, were caused by booby traps or mines, sometimes by our own mines that were found and reused by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese. The US, in addition to the Claymore in Vietnam, deployed the M14 landmine, sometimes known as the toe popper. That is a landmine. You put that in the ground, hoping people will step on it. Variations of that landmine, the M14, are at use around the world in conflicts ever since the 1960s. Many of which are still there. And we also laid aerial mines that we emplaced from the air, known as scatter babies. And the problem with these things, in many mines like this that are actually in the ground, is it's totally different than World War II. In World War II, we knew where the mines were because the Germans kept very careful maps. So when those POWs went out to get the mines after 1945, they knew where to look. They had the maps. But with mines around the world today, those landmines, there's no fronts. Nobody kept any detailed maps. The fronts would go like this and this if there were any. Usually the war would be all around you, like in Vietnam. It's very difficult to know where the mines are. And that's why they keep being a problem today as civilians step on them. In Vietnam, Congo, Angola, El Salvador, Bosnia, Colombia, Mozambique, anywhere where these guerrilla conflicts raged ever since, especially the 1960s. In Vietnam alone, as of 1975, at the end of the war, there were 35 million undetonated landmines. 35 million undetonated landmines in Vietnam in 1975, which means they were bound to kill civilians who had not even been born in 1975. And Vietnam was not alone. By 1994, all around the globe, there were an estimated 200 million landmines still out there in 70 different countries, sometimes called the perfect soldiers because they would stay on duty and never leave. And 2,000 people every month by 1994 were being killed or injured by stepping on landmines, civilians. Maybe the all-time leader by then, by the 1980s and early 90s, was Afghanistan, where 45,000 civilians have been killed or badly injured by stepping on these mines. But all around the globe, we had a problem. And there were tens of thousands of terrible stories like the one that afflicted this girl here. She's 5 years old. Her family was trying to get away from the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. This is the early 80s, where the Khmer Rouge still had pockets of resistance in the western part of Cambodia. She was told by her mother to go into a little woods where there was a stream and gather some water. She's walking towards the stream, 5 years old, steps on a mine, blows her into the air, falls down, and then she wondered why she couldn't get up. She tried to get up, she couldn't get up, and then she saw that most of her leg was gone. She crawled as best she could, losing blood. She screamed so loud that her family was able to find her. They got her to a refugee camp not far away, but the supplies there were not what they should have been. There was hardly an anesthetic. The best anesthetic they could give her in the first operation was a stick to bite on. She bit on the stick. They took off what was left of her leg below the knee. She had 16 separate operations all through her youth. Finally, however, she was able to begin to make do on her own. They gave her a prosthetic, and she is now a nurse in Cambodia, helping the victims of others who have stepped on mines. I did want to point out, when it comes to mines, that the story of Cambodia and other places is actually pretty encouraging in a way, because guess who the best things are to find a mine? If you've got a metal detector, those are pretty good, but you know what the problem with them are? You go into a field, you think there are mines there, and it starts picking up a bunch of metal signals, but that could be scrap iron. And you're wasting your time with a metal detector if you're just getting a bunch of metal that has nothing to do with mines. But there's a pretty infallible way to find a mine, and those are rats. Those are rats from East Africa, and they're specially trained to detect mines because their sense of smell is so good that once they're trained infallibly, they can sniff out the explosives that would signify the presence of a landmine. Cambodia is now the home of hundreds of what are called hero rats, who go into anywhere where there might be a mine, and they're also used in other places around the world. And they start sniffing around and they stop wherever there's a mine, and now people know where to go with a small implement to try to dig them up. They are beloved by the non-governmental organizations that demine areas around the world that use them. They all have names. One rat is named Harry Potter. Another hero rat is named Lady Godiva. This particular rat, this hero rat, is named Magawa. And I'm going to remember the hero rats because I live in Somerville. Now and then we see them. And I'm not going to be maybe as contemptuous of rats after knowing about the wonderful job they're doing in Cambodia. And all this has really been going on, by the way, the great demining efforts around the world with the use of hero rats and other ways to find the mines and get them out of the ground. All that's really been going on only really in the last 35 years. There are two great world historical demining efforts. The first one was in Europe after World War II, and the second one is going on right now, all around the world. And there's a reason why we've been able to do that, a great human success story in the last 35 years. And one of the reasons is this woman here, that's Jody Williams, who went to college at the University of Vermont while the Vietnam War was going on. Forget what she studied, but she didn't know what exactly she was going to do with her life. She thought she might be a dental assistant. She tried being a dental assistant, but that wasn't for her. She actually fainted 7 times on the first day. So maybe I'm not going to be in the medical profession. So she went to work as a Spanish teacher, went down to Mexico because she could also teach English by then, and did so well, was so interested in Mexican politics that she decided to make international relations her field. She got into Johns Hopkins, she got a big degree in international relations, and she began protesting US involvement during the 1980s in Central America. And that brought her the attention of the Vietnam Veterans of America. By the early 1990s, the Vietnam Veterans of America were very interested in trying to do something about all the unexploded mines in Vietnam and other places around the world that were killing and maiming civilians. Unexploded ordnance as well, but also landmines. And they collaborated with Human Rights Watch. The Red Cross was interested in getting involved, but they needed somebody to spearhead the efforts. They needed somebody to actually make it happen, somebody to be in charge. So they chose her, largely chosen by the Vietnam Veterans of America. They wanted her to coordinate efforts to raise awareness around the world of the problem of unexploded landmines. And their ultimate aim was not just to demine as much as they could, if they could, but also to secure the passage of an international treaty banning the production and use of landmines. So she got to work in early 1992. She traveled the world. She spoke to everybody she could speak to. Within a few years, it wasn't just Human Rights Watch and the Vietnam Veterans of America and the Red Cross government behind her. Eventually, 1,000 separate individual organizations around the world signed on to this effort, led by Jody Williams, an effort that would come to be known as the International Campaign Against Landmines. Wherever she went, she spoke heartrendingly of examples of people whose lives have been ruined by landmines. She would point out something that is quite clear if you think about it. A landmine placed by one person might end up killing their granddaughter a few years later, because these things just stick around, especially if they're in the ground. She would talk about, for example, the need to do something about a perfect soldier that in fact is the worst possible thing for civilians. How would she be able to do that? She would often talk to audiences that weren't terribly friendly. Offices that she would establish around the world, like in El Salvador, were ransacked by people who wanted nothing to do with this organization. She was threatened on many occasions. But the reason she could do it, as it turned out, and I think this is why the Vietnam veterans chose well, was that personally, she seemed to be absolutely fearless. Because when she was growing up, she had a brother who had a terrible hearing impairment. And people would make fun of him, they would bully him. And she would stand up for her brother. And she wouldn't take any abuse against her brother. And she learned not to be afraid of people. And that allowed her to get in front of audiences. She was afraid of what she saw as a dental assistant, but she wasn't afraid of people. And that made her the perfect person for this campaign. And she began to show progress until one big event, after years of progress that maybe was a bit too slow for the likes of her, changed more minds than any other about landmines and the need to get a treaty to ban their production and use. And that happened when Princess Diana made her famous walk in Angola. And there she is, it's 1997. HALO is one of the organizations that signed on to the International Campaign Against Landmines. And on behalf of HALO, there she is walking through a minefield. She's got protective gear on. It's a pretty brave thing for her to do. That photograph, the film, was shown all around the world. And very, very quickly, more and more organizations and governments signed on. The year before that, Canada had begun to advocate for an international treaty, the first country to do that. And after Diana's walk, and especially after she died later in the year, more countries began to advocate for it, so that at the end of 1997, finally, 122 countries signed on to the International Treaty to Ban Landmines, also known as the International Convention to Ban Landmines. And within a very short time, Jody Williams and her organization were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the international symbol all around the world where there might be mines. It's always red, and it's in different languages, of course, wherever you are. And demining efforts are always going on behind those signs, partly because of this organization that Jody Williams did so much to popularize. And this is one of her associates in the effort to demine areas around the world. His name is Tun Chanareth. He's a Cambodian, and he's been tireless, just like Jody Williams, in going wherever he needs to do, despite his disability, to talk to anybody he needs to talk to about demining efforts. So the treaty was actually negotiated and signed by the middle of the 1990s, began with 122 countries. Now there's 164 countries that have signed it. And what they say in the treaty is that they won't manufacture or use landmines, and they'll cooperate with efforts to demine wherever they happen to be. That treaty was signed at a time when, for example, in Angola, there were still 100,000 unexploded mines. There's now less than half that in Angola because of efforts under this treaty. And that makes it, all around the world where similar stories can be told, one of the great success stories in the history of anti-weapon conventions. Unfortunately, there has been an uptick in landmine incidents among civilians, especially in the last 18 months, mostly due to the war in Myanmar, where all parties use anti-personnel mines despite the treaty, and where government forces force civilians to walk ahead of them in any areas where soldiers think there might be mines laid by rebel forces. No one knows how many civilians have been killed by landmines or injured in Myanmar. We don't have the statistics, we just have stories by refugees, including one story of a man who sent his two nephews out into the woods to try to find some sweet potatoes. And there they are digging up the sweet potatoes. Next thing the man hears, the uncle, is loud explosions, and he goes in and he finds what's left of his nephews. We have stories like that, but those are only anecdotes. We don't know how many have been killed. Not all countries are signatories. The United States, for example, is not a signatory to this treaty, banning the manufacture use of landmines. And we have a couple points to make about the treaty. First of all, one thing we always point out is that the treaty by its terms doesn't apply to the claymores. So we still manufacture claymores, I think. And our point is that they're activated routinely by soldiers in the perimeter who know the enemy is approaching. So they're not anti-personnel mines in the ground. They're activated by soldiers, and they're typically used on front, especially in Ukraine, front lines where civilian casualties are less likely. However, as most of you know, claymores can be also activated by tripwires that the enemy trips up as they approach the area. Those are banned by the landmine treaty, but technically not if they're activated by soldiers who just want them to protect their perimeters. The other thing we point out is that the kind of landmines that we still have in our arsenal, and we've got over 1 million landmines, anti-personnel mines that you put in the ground in our arsenal. And they're usually the M14s, like what you would have seen in Vietnam, for example. We think we need to maintain that arsenal and not destroy them like other countries have done, for the reason that we need to deter the North Koreans. So we've got a lot of these mines in the ground, not in the demilitarized zone, I guess not far from the demilitarized zone, in areas where civilians aren't supposed to go. And the idea is that could be a deterrent, could hurt the North Koreans if they were to invade. And our contention is we need to maintain them for that reason. So we still have them in the arsenal. Technically, we don't manufacture them anymore. We have them, but we don't make them. And the other thing to point out is that we don't actually maintain any minefields anywhere in the world. We haven't maintained a minefield since 1991, I believe. The minefields of South Korea are maintained by the South Koreans, not us. So we often point that out. And the other thing that we like to point out is that although we do sell these things, I guess provide them to the Ukrainians, we do provide the Ukrainians with claymores and something like the M14 to put in the ground. Our point is it's not so bad, not just because these are fighting fronts and not rear areas where civilians are, but also because they degrade after a few weeks. So the explosives shouldn't hurt anybody after a few weeks. They're not like mini mines that keep killing after 30 years, that they should be gone after a little while. So that tends to be our defense, and that's why we've been using them. So the story today is in large measure a positive one. Under that treaty, most countries have destroyed whatever stocks of landmines they had. Nobody knows how many. One estimate I've heard is half of all landmines in the arsenals of the world have been destroyed under this treaty, negotiated and signed in the middle of the 1990s. But they still kill people today. Not nearly as many as at the beginning of the 1990s, but thousands of people still are killed every day by unexploded mines. And what is happening all around the world is efforts to demine continue and continue until the scourge may eventually be a thing of the past. Some countries have been declared mine-free. Mozambique was recently declared mine-free because of these efforts under Jody Williams' organization and the groups that are part of her organization. But in other places, the efforts still go on and casualties still happen. Now, at this point, to conclude, if you'll indulge me, I want to put on a hat because one of the heroes of the story, I think, is a Vietnam veteran who I kind of knew. I used to see this guy in Athens, Georgia. And this is the way he appeared back in the 1960s. His name is Chuck Searcy. And he grew up in Thompson, Georgia, not too far from Athens. And when he was a teenager, he decided he wanted to study music at the University of Georgia. He got there, he dared to question the methods of one of his professors, and that professor wasn't used to being questioned. So he took Chuck Searcy's trombone and he threw it in the trash can. And then Searcy decided, maybe this isn't the place for me. He left UGA, then he was drafted. He wasn't in college anymore. And then he found himself in Vietnam. 1966, he was an intelligence officer in Saigon. Did a tour of duty in Vietnam, put another year into the military after that. And then, after discharge, he went back to school. He decided to give UGA, University of Georgia, another chance. He didn't get a degree, went to law school, opened up a newspaper, famous in Athens, the Athens Observer. Everybody knew this guy. He was active in progressive groups all over Athens, pretty well known in the Democratic Party. He became the head of the Georgia Trial Lawyers Association at one point, very successful. And then his success and his activism for progressive causes brought him to the notice of the Vietnam Veterans of America. And they decided to recruit him to help in demining efforts in Vietnam. They thought he'd be the perfect person. And so in 1996, Chuck Searcy went back to Vietnam to head up an organization dedicated to providing prosthetic limbs for Vietnamese who've been injured by unexploded landmines, also unexploded ordnance, but landmines as well. And before long, he and a group of Norwegians that he met had founded their own organization associated with Jody Williams' campaign against landmines called Project Renew. And Project Renew is still working in Vietnam, especially around Quang Tri, just south of the old demilitarized zone. And they also work around, also the Quang Tri province, they work around Quai Son as well. So he's been living full-time in Vietnam since the 1990s. He speaks fluent Vietnamese, probably the most well-known and popular American in all Vietnam. He's now 80, he just turned 80 years old. And he was in the news a couple of days ago because he's spearheading a new effort to find unexploded mines in a part of the Central Highlands where little efforts of demining have been made to this point. So there he is with Vietnamese volunteers wearing American flags on their jackets, as you can see, still in his own way, trying to do something to help people and get rid of the perfect soldiers so that people can go about their business in the peace and quiet and safety that all of us deserve. So I'd like to end by paying tribute to Chuck Searcy and of course to all of you. And as I always enjoy having the privilege of doing at these events, to thank you for your service. Thank you.
And Dan, of course, will be pleased to entertain your questions. Is Bob Lewis here? Bob? Oh, Bob will take one half of the room. I'll take the other. And wait for us to hand you a microphone. Speak into the microphone so your question will be recorded when we record the program. Thank you. You go first. You can be
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, my question is trivial, I think, but I'm curious about the hero wraps.
Yes.
Number one, are they light enough in weight so that when they discover the mines, they don't detonate them?
They do not detonate the mines.
They do not.
Too light, yeah.
And the other part of that question is, in places like Vietnam, can they not use those same kind of hero wraps?
Well, I think they've tried in parts of Vietnam where there's less vegetation than in other places. I think they work better when there's not a lot of other smells to confuse them. But my impression is that it's so difficult to train them, and it takes so long to train them, that they're only in use in a limited number of places. And Cambodia so far is the best example. So they really are not easily confused, because it's really just explosives that they're really going to react to, but only if they're properly trained. So if they're anywhere where they're not properly trained, that they're not much use, they go after a whole bunch of different things. But once they're trained, once they're in service, they often have about 8 years in front of them if they live a normal lifespan. And that's why the people who handle them grow attached to them. They get to know them pretty well. Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
That was absolutely first rate. I really appreciate your comments today.
Oh, thank you.
Clear, and your slides were wonderful. I have a question about wooden landmines that are unable to be detected
Yeah.
by metal detectors.
Mhm.
In my reading, I have run across a fair amount of wooden landmines.
Yeah.
You didn't mention them at all. Are they worrisome? Where do they exist? And what can we do about them?
They are worrisome. My understanding is they exist in Central and South America and also parts of Africa. And they're a bit more expensive to deal with, because with a shortage of rats that can actually sniff out the explosives, and with a shortage of dogs who can also do the same thing, dogs can be trained to do this as well. What you need with a wooden contraption surrounding a mine is new technologies that are now being developed to deal with just that. And what they've got now is a new generation of drones that are equipped to detect them beneath the surface. So if you've got drones, you can find them and you know where to go and you can dig them out. The problem, though, is those things are expensive, and these international organizations that engage in demining don't necessarily have all the money in the world. So they're not in as much use as we'd like them to be, but that there is a way to do it, and that's how it's being done. I did want to mention before I forget, is that one good thing the US has done with these anti-personnel mines we still have, those M14s, is that they used to be largely plastic. So it was very difficult for a metal detector to know where they were. So what we've begun to do is put little metal tabs on them, so that if anybody wants to go find them later on, if they're still there somewhere, a metal detector ought to be able to find them.
Another excellent presentation. Thank you so much. One first comment is, I was in Vietnam. Now with the Claymores, one of the things that happened was, out in the boonies, the enemy would come up and sneak up and turn the Claymore around to face the person that was headed, and then start rustling leaves and stuff, and wait for him to ignite the Claymore. But the other thing is,
Gosh,
the other thing is, how do you search out to find out how, information enough to do one of your excellent presentations? How do you do your research?
oh, well, I steal from other people. That's how I do it. People have written articles and books about landmines. They're the real experts, and I just comb through all that. It would have been much more difficult to do back in the days before the internet. But now most of those books are available somehow. They're available through the Brandeis library, so I have access to them. So I just read as much as I can. I'm always very grateful to engage with you, because I get these topics that I don't necessarily know a whole lot about. Like Linda gave me the landmine topic, so that's interesting. Never really looked into that. And so I was really excited to do it. And I found out a lot that I didn't know. So with the Claymore mine, if you wanted to prevent the enemy from doing that, would you have to depend on a tripwire in front of the position so they would trip up the mine as they approached it?
I'm just repeating the hearsay I got when I was over there.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you, sir. I just had one question.
yes,
On the photo with the World War I Army tank in the field.
yeah.
What were those two large wheels on the rear of it?
Well, let's go back to the tank. They're there for balance, right? Let's see. If I can get back to the right place. Here we are. Let's see, well, it doesn't seem like they'd be there for balance, does it?
And I don't know.
Oh, so you're going through, you're approaching a trench, maybe you dip into it, those things would help you propel out of it. Maybe, I'm just guessing, that would be the topic for another presentation, how these monsters actually work. But one thing probably some of you have seen is the tried and true method that a tank would have of detecting anti-tank mines and doing something about them in front of them. And these are actually still used in parts of the world today by deminers. What they'll do is they'll put in front of a contraption, not necessarily a tank now, but some other armored vehicle that would use these flails. The flails will go up and down. You've probably seen them in war movies and things, or you've even seen them in person. And they'd be right in front of you and they could detect where a mine was and maybe explode it so that it wouldn't hurt the vehicle right behind the flails. So those flails are still used as well. And that's an innovation of World War II. So it's been 80 years since those things went into service, some of them. And the British did that first with these kinds of things. They had the first generation of flails in World War I because they were so worried about those anti-tank mines.
Oh, okay. Is he done? Hi, I'm the French-speaking person that you heard before the presentation.
Hi.
So, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really excellent. And as someone who grew up in an area where many unexploded bombs and mines were still, I grew up in Alsace, and you may know that
Sure.
there still are mines in some places. I was kind of curious if you could go to the next slide. And having a pretty good knowledge of the border, my family being from Alsace-Lorraine.
Yeah.
I was wondering, why did they go in the South Valley and not through the Rhine to Germany? Because that was French back then, right?
Mm-hmm.
But thank you so much. I mean, I remember as a kid when my dad, who had been fighting during World War II, said, "Don't go there because that's a minefield." So that's,
Well,
but thank you so much.
my understanding was their idea was to go into that area because they were interested in the munitions facilities there, the industrial plant. But I don't know how much strategic sense it made, but I think that's might be what they were thinking. And it offered an easy retreat if they needed to. But it was always a half-hearted offensive. Nothing like what eventually Eisenhower would launch, of course, in the end of 44, early 45.
From the Battle of the Bulge either.
Not too far, yeah, but it's south of there, right? But not too far. Mhm. Many people wondered how history would be different if they had actually maintained that offensive. But it wasn't to be. Yes, go ahead.
Does the UN have any position about mine? Does the United Nations have any position about?
Yeah, United Nations fully supports the international campaign for the banning of landmines. The treaty that bans landmines was under the auspices ultimately of the UN. They convened the countries together for the signing of that treaty in Ottawa. So it actually is an official UN document. Nobody in the Security Council ever made any effort to prevent that from happening. Although maybe ironically, several members of the Security Council don't observe it in every possible way, among them the United States and Russia. But it is officially a UN document and supported by the General Assembly. Okay.
Any more? That's it?
Well, thank you, everyone.
Anybody on Zoom? All right, well, join me.
Is there one more
There
question?
had to be more questions, okay.
Yeah, you mentioned about the rats.
Yeah.
8 year lifespan. Why didn't they use small dog? The dog has a longer lifespan.
Yeah, they do use dogs. And I don't think it's as difficult to train dogs to do it. It may be that they're worried about the greater weight. Maybe there was a chance that a dog could set off a mine. Maybe that had happened in a few places, but
Well, some of these dogs are no bigger than those rats.
yeah, they're pretty small. You're right. Well, the answer is they are used in some parts of the world.
There's a lifespan of those dogs, those small dogs, short also, or
Yeah, I would think so.
there's a lot of dogs that are 15, 20 years old, 15, 20 years.
Yeah, and I don't know why they wouldn't be used more often, but it could well be they're used in parts of the world that don't use the rats. It might be, I didn't look that much into that part of it, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. I know they are used.
I know, where we train dogs today, they're trained to do a lot of things, they seem very successful in training dogs.
Yes, well, dogs are incredible. The most efficient noses in nature. And what is the statistics? If you had 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools and you dumped a little bit of tomato juice in one of them, a dog would be able to sniff out exactly the pool, exactly the place where the tomato juice was. So obviously, they're gonna be pretty good at explosives if they know what they're doing.
All right, that does it for questions. Let us give Dan a warm round of applause.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you again.
He was such a good sport. When we asked him to come back again, he said, I would be happy to. And he said, I'll accept any suggestions for topics, you know, I mean, he can just pick out one himself from any number of topics. So we made a suggestion about landmines. He said, I'd love to. Now, don't you want about 25 just like him? He was great.
Oh,
So
very kind.
thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you. Good to
Pleasure
be here for
have
the
you
first
back.
time. Brookhaven.
Okay, so that concludes our presentation for this afternoon. Again, remember our next presentation in February. The doctors who work so hard to keep our soldiers disease-free. So that will be for next month. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. You've been a great audience. See you next month. Good afternoon.